Black and white images flicker across the screen. Factory workers at lathes, molten steel pouring into molds, the assembly lines of Detroit humming with motion. Before there was a D-Day, before tanks rolled across France, a different battle was being fought, not on the front lines, but in the foundries and factories of the United States. It was there that Dwight D. Eisenhower's most decisive weapon was forged, the machine of production itself. As Europe burned, America watched from across the ocean, divided, uncertain, and unprepared. The US Army ranked 19th in the world, behind Portugal and Romania. Eisenhower, then a mid-ranking officer at Fort Lewis, knew that if America entered the war it would not be ready. Yet he also sensed that the nation's strength lay not in its soldiers, but in its steel, its oil, its railroads, and its restless ingenuity. The question was how to turn that potential into power. In Washington and in the boardrooms of American industry, a new alliance began to form, generals, engineers, and factory owners asking the same urgent question. If the United States went to war, how fast could it build an army? The answer began to take shape on a December evening in 1940 when President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke to the nation. His voice, calm but firm, carried over the airwaves. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. The phrase struck a chord that resonated from New York to California. In Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, production lines that had once built cars and household goods began to retool for war. At the vast River Rouge plant, Ford engineers learned to stamp out tank hulls instead of fenders. Chrysler, General Motors, and hundreds of smaller firms joined the effort. No other nation in history had attempted such a transformation. It was as if an entire economy had put on a uniform. By mid-1941, the pace was astonishing. Automobile plants now built engines for bombers. Boeing expanded production of the B-17 Flying Fortress. On the coasts, Liberty ships slid down their ramps and into the water, first every few days, soon every few hours. America was awakening as the world's factory of war. Meanwhile in Washington, Eisenhower pored over logistics maps and supply charts. Assigned to the War Plans Division, he immersed himself in the mathematics of movement, tonnage, transport, supply lines. He realized that courage and tactics would not win the next war, organization would. The war will be won, he wrote, when we can get everything we need where we need it, faster than the enemy can stop us. He began to see armies as extensions of assembly lines, efficient, continuous, unstoppable. Then came December 7, 1941. The sky over Pearl Harbor turned black with smoke. The United States was at war. Overnight, the country transformed. Car production ceased entirely. Rubber, steel, and copper were rationed. Factories ran around the clock. Floodlights turned night into day in cities that had never known 24-hour work. In Henry Kaiser's shipyards, entire cargo ships were built in less than 5 days. A worker from that time remembered, you'd come in for the midnight shift, and the whistle never stopped. It was like the whole country was humming. This was the inheritance Eisenhower would soon command, not yet an army of men, but of machines, steel, and determination. America's energy, ingenuity, and industry became his true arsenal. In that surge of production lay the power that would one day shock Germany. By the end of 1942, the numbers told the story better than speeches ever could. 45,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, 8 million tons of shipping. What had once been an unarmed nation had become a continent-sized factory for victory. One historian would later say, the Germans had better generals, but Eisenhower had the better supply chain, and that's what won the war. Late in 1942, Eisenhower boarded a plane for London, bound for his first major command. He carried no sword, no secret weapon, only faith in the industrial miracle behind him. Factories, shipyards, and railroads were his first armies. The world was about to learn that in modern war, the greatest weapon is not a tank or a bomb, but the ability to build and deliver both faster than your enemy can dream of. The winter of 1942 settled over America with the roar of machines. Across the continent, furnaces glowed and factories thundered day and night. The United States had entered the war, but victory was still a distant dream. The challenge now was not just to build, but to deliver, to feed the growing giant of war that was spreading across the globe. In Washington, Eisenhower studied charts covered with arrows and figures. Ships, trains, depots all had to move in perfect rhythm. It was not enough to have tanks and planes. They had to reach the front lines on time, fueled, armed, and ready. For Eisenhower, logistics was no longer a science. It was an art of motion and momentum. Every bullet, every can of gasoline, every loaf of bread had to find its way across oceans and deserts to the men who would fight. The test came quickly. In November 1942, under the codename Operation Torch, Eisenhower commanded the first major Allied invasion of the war, North Africa. It was a daring plan, to land an American army across thousands of miles of ocean, establish ports, build roads, and fight the German Afrika Korps in terrain few had ever seen. The logistics were staggering. Hundreds of ships left American harbors loaded with tanks, trucks, jeeps, food, and ammunition. Each carried carefully labeled crates, each destined for a soldier, a unit, a battle. When the convoys crossed the Atlantic, the ocean became Eisenhower's assembly line. Navy escorts guarded merchant ships through the dark seas where German U-boats hunted relentlessly. Supplies were packed so tightly that some ships carried bulldozers on deck and rations in the crew's quarters. Yet through storm and danger, they came. Within weeks, American forces were unloading in Algiers and Casablanca, the first test of the new war machine. The Germans, accustomed to shortages and rationing, could scarcely believe the scale of what they saw. At captured Allied depots, they found mountains of food, spare parts, and gasoline. An astonished German officer wrote in his diary, "The Americans have so much material that it seems to pour from the sky." What they did not yet understand was that this abundance was not waste, it was strategy. Eisenhower's plan was to overwhelm the enemy not only with men, but with supply. In North Africa, supply became survival. Convoys of olive drab trucks, known as Red Bull runs, carried food and ammunition across the desert. Drivers braved heat, sandstorms, and ambushes to keep the army moving. Eisenhower's command posts were filled with maps showing routes, depots, and fuel dumps. He watched every report, measuring the pulse of the war not by enemy positions, but by tonnage delivered. He knew that if the trucks stopped, the war stopped. As the campaign advanced eastward toward Tunisia, the machinery of supply evolved. Engineers built ports, railways, and airfields almost overnight. Damaged tanks were repaired in the field. Food was canned, packed, and shipped in millions of rations, each one a promise that the army could fight another day. It was here, among the heat and chaos, that Eisenhower's theories became reality. Logistics, once a quiet word in an office, had become the heartbeat of modern warfare. By the summer of 1943, North Africa was secure. The Allied armies had learned hard lessons: how to move faster, how to coordinate ships, trucks, and aircraft across continents. Eisenhower looked out across the Mediterranean toward Sicily and Italy, knowing that even larger operations awaited. Behind every battle now stood an invisible army of workers, sailors, drivers, and engineers, the millions who kept the machine alive. Back home, the miracle of production was accelerating. American factories poured out goods with unmatched speed. One B-24 bomber rolled off the line every hour. Shells and bullets filled warehouses by the millions. Every week, Liberty ships set sail, their holds packed to the brim with the materials of war. The lines between civilian and soldier blurred. A woman riveting the wings of a plane in California was as vital to victory as a gunner in Tunisia. The German High Command began to study American supply networks in disbelief. They intercepted reports describing thousands of vehicles arriving at African ports, enough to move entire armies in days. Hitler himself dismissed the figures as propaganda. Yet on the ground, his generals saw the truth. A nation that could replace in weeks what Germany lost in months. Eisenhower's tool of victory was beginning to show its true strength. Every barrel of oil, every pair of boots, every crate of ammunition was part of a greater rhythm, a pulse that stretched from Kansas rail yards to Algerian ports, from Detroit assembly lines to desert airstrips. The United States was not merely fighting, it was feeding an ever-growing force that seemed to multiply with every mile. By the end of 1943, Eisenhower had proved what many once thought impossible. The United States could fight a global war on multiple fronts and still outproduce every other nation combined. In the deserts of North Africa, amid dust and sun, the concept of total logistics had been born, a new way of wagging war, one that turned factories into front lines and convoys into weapons. The stage was now set for something far greater. Across the Channel in the misty fields of England, the next great operation was taking shape, one that would test the limits of supply and organization on a scale the world had never seen. The machine was running, and Eisenhower was about to aim it at the heart of Fortress Europe. By the winter of 1943, the skies over England roared with the sound of preparation. American ships crowded the harbors, British fields were filled with tents and airstrips, and the narrow roads overflowed with trucks, tanks, and soldiers. From the air, southern England looked like an enormous engine, its pistons churning, its gears tightening. The invasion of Europe was coming, and Dwight D. Eisenhower was the man who would make it move. He had learned the lessons of North Africa. Victory depended not just on courage, but on the endless flow of material. Now he faced the greatest logistical challenge in history. To defeat Germany, he would have to land an army across the English Channel, sustain it through storms and enemy fire, and then drive it across an entire continent. It would be in every sense a war of movement, and that meant a war of supply. In the planning rooms of London, maps covered every wall. Red lines traced shipping routes, supply depots, and the thousands of miles of rail that would feed the invasion. Eisenhower's staff counted everything. The gallons of gasoline a division would need each day, the tons of ammunition fired per hour, the number of socks, tires, and spare parts required to keep 1 million men alive and fighting. Every calculation meant lives saved or lost. Factories back home were already turning those numbers into reality. In Detroit, Ford produced trucks so quickly that entire convoys rolled off the assembly line in neat rows, engines still warm from testing. On the docks of New York and Boston, Liberty ships lined up in shimmering rows, each packed with cargo that would be vital to the invasion: food, fuel, vehicles, medical supplies, and the secret components of the floating harbors that would one day be known as the Mulberries. The Mulberry harbors were among the most daring inventions of the war, vast artificial ports built in sections, towed across the Channel, and assembled off the coast of France. Eisenhower understood that the invasion would fail unless he could create new ports where none existed. His engineers built floating piers, breakwaters made of sunken ships, and roadways that could withstand the pounding of the sea. It was industry turned into architecture, engineering as strategy. As the months passed, England became the staging ground of an empire of logistics. Warehouses stretched for miles. Every town and field seemed filled with vehicles, stacked crates, and the hum of generators. Soldiers joked that even the cows had been drafted. Every meal, every bullet, every drop of fuel came from the machine Eisenhower had helped shape, a machine that never slept. German intelligence saw the build-up and was stunned. Reports described an endless river of supplies pouring into Britain, so vast that even conservative estimates dwarfed anything Germany could produce. Hitler's generals spoke of American magic, but there was nothing magical about it. It was precision, coordination, and the sheer will to organize chaos into order. By spring of 1944, the plan for Operation Overlord was ready. Eisenhower looked at the maps spread across his headquarters and saw not just arrows and objectives, but the arteries of a living system. He knew that once the invasion began, every man on those beaches would depend on the rhythm of the supply lines behind him. He spent as much time with logisticians and engineers as with combat generals. The success of D-Day would not only depend on courage under fire, it would depend on whether the flow of food, fuel, and ammunition could keep pace with the fighting. On June 6, 1944, the storm broke. Thousands of ships crossed the Channel, carrying soldiers, vehicles, and supplies toward Normandy. As the first waves hit the beaches, chaos erupted, but the machine did not stop. Within hours, engineers were building roads, unloading cargo, repairing vehicles. By nightfall, the beaches were covered not only with men and tanks, but with cranes, bulldozers, and endless stacks of crates. The invasion of Europe had begun, and Eisenhower's tool of victory was in motion. In the days that followed, the scale of the effort defied imagination. Hundreds of ships ferried supplies across the Channel. Trucks rolled onto temporary docks, carrying fuel and ammunition inland. Pipeline crews worked day and night to lay fuel lines under the sea, the famous Pluto project, pipeline under the ocean, which would deliver gasoline straight from England to France. Every barrel of oil, every can of food, every box of bullets had its place in the vast symphony of logistics. The Germans had prepared for an army, but not for an economy. They had built fortresses and tanks, but they could not match the relentless tide of Allied material. For every German shell fired, the Allies fired 5. For every tank destroyed, 3 more landed on the shore. Eisenhower's genius lay not in battlefield maneuver alone, but in the quiet precision of supply, the invisible structure that allowed armies to advance without pause. By the end of the summer, the Allies had liberated Paris. Trains carried fuel and food through France as engineers repaired bridges and roads. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system manned largely by African-American drivers, roared day and night from the ports to the front. They drove through mud and darkness, guided only by headlamps painted black for camouflage, delivering the lifeblood of the army: fuel, ammunition, food. The men of the Red Ball Express became a legend, living proof that logistics was the true engine of victory. By autumn, Eisenhower's forces stood on the border of Germany. The machine had carried them from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Europe. Every bridge they crossed, every road they built, every depot that rose from rubble was part of the same vast design, a web of steel and supply stretching from the factories of America to the front lines of liberation. The war was not yet won, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies had proven that power was not only measured in guns or soldiers, but in the ability to sustain them endlessly across oceans and continents. Eisenhower's tool of victory, the disciplined, unstoppable machinery of logistics, had built the bridge to freedom. The winter of 1944 brought with it a silence that felt heavier than gunfire. The German army, battered but still dangerous, clung to the borders of its homeland. Snow fell across ruined towns and shattered bridges as the Allies pressed forward, their advance powered by a force unlike anything the world had seen. Behind every rifle, every tank, every bomber, moved the immense machine that Dwight D. Eisenhower had set in motion, the machine that Germany now faced head-on. The German generals, veterans of countless campaigns, had never seen war like this. They had studied strategy, maneuver, and tactics, but none of their training had prepared them for the sight of an enemy that seemed to possess limitless strength. When a panzer division destroyed an Allied column, another replaced it within days. When fuel depots were bombed, new convoys arrived from the coast. One German officer wrote in his journal, "They fight with factories. Their weapons are not men, but machines and the endless ships that feed them." By December, the Allies had advanced deep into Belgium and the Netherlands, pushing toward the Rhine. Yet Eisenhower knew that victory was not just a matter of territory. Every mile gained stretched the supply lines farther, and the machine strained under its own weight. The Red Ball Express still roared across France, delivering fuel and ammunition, but the distances were long, the weather bitter, and the roads choked with mud. Eisenhower spent long nights at his headquarters studying reports, measuring fuel consumption and delivery schedules with the same care others gave to troop movements. He understood that even the strongest army could be stopped by an empty gas tank. Then in mid-December, Germany struck back. The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, caught the Allies off guard. For the first time since D-Day, the front shuddered. Snowstorms grounded aircraft and supply convoys struggled through icy roads. Eisenhower's calm was unbroken. He knew that if the machine could hold, the counterattack would fail. Every available truck was redirected to feed the front lines. Fuel was rationed, ammunition redistributed, supplies rerouted through newly repaired roads. Within days, the system adapted. When the skies cleared, Allied planes took to the air, bombing German columns and dropping supplies to trapped units. The tide turned and the Bulge collapsed. The victory in the Ardennes proved that Eisenhower's weapon was not just material abundance. It was flexibility, coordination, and the ability to recover from chaos faster than the enemy could exploit it. The German army, running out of fuel and replacements, was disintegrating. Hitler had gambled everything on one last offensive, but the Allied machine, though strained, had endured. The momentum resumed, and the long columns of trucks and tanks rolled east once more. As the snow melted in early 1945, the Rhine River came into view, the final great barrier before Germany's heartland. Engineers raced forward, building pontoon bridges under fire. When one bridge was destroyed, another appeared in its place within hours. The sheer speed and precision of the Allied advance stunned observers. It was like watching a factory march, one soldier said. Every man, every truck, every shell, all part of the same rhythm. Inside Germany, civilians watched in disbelief as the Allied war machine filled the skies and roads. Endless convoys thundered past, carrying food, fuel, and troops. American trucks outnumbered German tanks. Allied aircraft blackened the horizon. What the German people had once believed impossible, that any nation could outproduce them, was now visible in every direction. The Reich cities lay in ruins, its armies starving, its factories silent. Eisenhower's tool of victory had achieved what bombs and bullets alone could not. It had crushed the enemy's ability to fight at all. By March, the Allies crossed the Rhine. Eisenhower's command stretched from the North Sea to the Alps, supplied by one of the most complex logistical networks ever created. Railways were rebuilt behind the lines. Pipelines carried fuel across hundreds of miles. Hospitals, bakeries, and repair shops moved forward with the troops, as if the United States itself were advancing, piece by piece, across Europe. The German army, once the most formidable in the world, was now a shadow of its former self. Soldiers surrendered by the thousands, their weapons abandoned. Many were astonished by what they saw in the captured Allied depots: stacks of food, new uniforms, crates of ammunition taller than a man. "We could not believe such wealth existed," one prisoner later recalled. "Everywhere we turned there was more. We were defeated by quantity as much as by skill." In April, as American and Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Eisenhower visited the front. The air smelled of spring and smoke. Columns of refugees filled the roads. Behind him, the machine still roared, trains unloading supplies, trucks grinding east, factories in America still humming. He stood quietly for a moment, aware that this massive engine of war had done its work. The weapon he had forged, the alliance of industry, logistics, and human resolve, had proven unstoppable. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the statistics told a story beyond imagination. American industry had produced more than 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and 85 million tons of shipping. But numbers alone could not capture what had happened. For the first time in history, a nation had turned its entire economy into a single, unified instrument of warfare, and done so with precision and purpose. Eisenhower's victory was not only military. It was industrial, organizational, and human. It showed that wars in the modern age would be won not only by those who fought on the front lines, but by those who built, transporting, and sustained from behind them. Germany, once the master of mechanized warfare, had been undone by a greater mechanic, the engine of democracy. As the soldiers celebrated and the guns fell silent, the factories that had once thundered for war began to slow. Workers returned home, ships unloaded their final cargoes, and the great machine of victory came to rest. Eisenhower would later say that he had been privileged to command the greatest team of logistics and spirit the world had ever known. The Germans had called it impossible. They had underestimated not just American industry, but the will that drove it, the belief that freedom itself could be manufactured, assembled, and delivered across the ocean. In the end, Eisenhower's tool of victory was not made of steel or oil. It was made of people, the millions who worked, built, shipped, and fought together until tyranny collapsed under the weight of their effort. And so, the world learned that the true measure of power lies not only in the strength to destroy, but in the strength to create, to build faster, to move farther, to sustain longer. In that balance of muscle and machinery, Eisenhower's America had found its greatest weapon. The machine had awakened, and in its thunder, the world heard the sound of victory.